Michel Foucault's writings are rich both in historical detail and speculative proposals, but that's not a reason for not trying to bring it down to earth. In this short lecture, I will link Foucault's views on power to other philosophical analysis of this rather elusive concept. To do so, I will rely on Foucault's two most referenced works, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, and The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, as the central sources of his analysis of power. Foucault opens his Discipline and Punish with two vignettes. The first one is of the execution in 1757 of a man called Damien. Damien was publicly executed. He was burned with torches. Pieces of flesh were torn out of his body with pincers. The holes thus left were filled with burning sulfur and boiling oil. Finally, his body was torn to pieces by 4 horses, after which his remains were burned and his ashes scattered. The second vignette is from 1838, and it is the daily timetable of the prison for young convicts in Paris. The day is rigidly divided into measured sections, reserved for prayer, learning, labor, exercise and cleaning, and all of the inmates are subject to the same regime. The transition from this first kind of punishment to the second kind is the topic of Foucault's book. Both vignettes illustrate the two faces of power. One is highly visible, dramatic, excessive, fast and violent. The other is quiet, almost invisible, and slow. The first one is commonly also called power, while the second one often escapes that qualification. We call it order, discipline, or something related to that. The fact is, we tend to see more power in policemen in riot gear rather than in a bureaucrat following rules. Power, just like other concepts, ideology, democracy, freedom, is one term that seems to suffer from permanent lack of specification. But the elusive character of power has not prevented generations of philosophers from thinking and writing about it. Plato, Machiavelli, Voltaire, and Marx are names that come to mind. And closer to our times, people like Gramsci, Arendt, Foucault, and many others have devoted important parts of their work to reflections on power. Trying to find patterns in this diversity of thinkers can only be tentative and open to revision. What I'll try to do is give a little vocabulary of power notions that will help you navigate the writings of Michel Foucault. One important distinction concerning the notion of power is that between hard and soft power. For instance, we can find this distinction in Gramsci's prison notebooks, when he distinguishes between a war of maneuver and a war of position. The war of maneuver is violent, revolutionary action that's aimed at seizing control over the state. Examples are like a putsch, rebellion, or insurrection. According to Gramsci, however, a successful power regime requires a war of position too, a slow and more careful battle for the hearts and minds of the people. So, once hard power is ours, soft power must make us accepted as rulers and must create popular support for our rule. A similar distinction is to be found in Hannah Arendt's On Violence. Arendt distinguished between strength, power, authority, and force. Let's focus on the distinction between power and authority, because in this way we can link it more directly to Gramsci's distinction between a war of maneuver and a war of position. Arendt follows Gramsci in suggesting that authority resides in consensual support for the regime, while power is the ultimate stick of that regime. When the regime loses or lacks authority, it has to resort to power and to force or violence in order to restore its strength. For Gramsci, as well as for Arendt, authority is the dominant form of power, while power is the determinant form. So, as long as people have confidence in elected parliaments and governments, those can rule by authority. When such confidence is lost, the government has to use its power and send the tanks in the streets to control the masses. So while hard and soft forms of power can be distinguished, they are procedurally connected. They operate together, and power is, on both conceptions, a system of composite forms. Machiavelli codified this in saying that the prince needed to be strong and gentle at the same time, cunning, smart, tolerant, and well-meaning, as well as ruthless, impulsive, and brutal. The prince needed to look at immediate dangers as well as long-term risks, and he should never be perceived as not in power. This brings us to another distinction for which Machiavelli can be used. Power as an individual feature versus power as a systemic feature. Think about it this way. Napoleon had power, Hitler and Stalin too. Consequently, a lot of literature and historical leaders describe such figures as the men in power, the only power in the system they ruled. It is often said that Machiavelli's prince captures this individual absolutism with respect to power. But Machiavelli's more important point was that the strong or individual prince needed to work with the people, and he required the support of his people. A purely and obsessively oppressive autocrat was not a good leader on Machiavelli's account. He could only be part of a larger system that upheld his power and, one can only add now, his authority, and to which he responded. This notion of systemic power is also highlighted in Marx's work. Das Kapital describes a system of production which systemically exerts power over the working class. This power is not individual. Overcoming capitalism, therefore, requires more than just imprisoning a few capitalists. Resistance against this power is a matter of changing the whole system, either by violent revolutionary means that would destroy the fabric of the old system, or by evolutionary ones aimed at extensive and deep participation of the oppressed classes in the system of power. The power system described by Marx and by several Marxists after him, as we will see, is one in which power is distributed over a wide variety of actors. The state collaborates with industrial capital and with the social classes that have immediate benefits from it, against those who have no benefits from it, the working class. Power, thus, is spread all over the system of social organization. A crucial ingredient of this systemic power, less theorized by Marx than by Gramsci and Lenin, is ideology. As Gramsci said, a regime can only be successful if it has acquired soft power. He argued that the bourgeoisie not only controlled the hard means of production and the powers of the state, but that they also controlled the fields of culture, spirituality, ideas, and science. They ruled not just by force and exploitation, but also by ideological hegemony, the complete dominance of their culture and ideas in society. Thus, a bid for power also needs to be a bid for hegemony, for control over the hearts and minds of the people. People must accept the new ideology as a non-ideology, as a normal state of affairs. This particular point of the normalization of power became a central ingredient in Foucault II, who described power as an all-pervasive system. Foucault focused on the gradual becoming of a particular regime of power, which went hand in hand with forms of knowledge. What does that mean? The birth of the modern prison, for instance, went alongside with the emergence of modern criminology, psychology and psychiatry, and sociology. These knowledge domains, epistemes, Foucault says, provide rational arguments for sustaining a particular power regime, which became, in Foucault's terms, capillary power, that is, power that stretches into the smallest and most private aspects of life, but also biopower, power that controls the way we live as physical entities through hygiene, public health, and formal education, and governmentality, which concerns the bureaucratization of all aspects of life. These forms of power create the modern subject, the individual, which is at the core of our self-perception. It is in this sense that Foucault says the individual is a product of power. Foucault also claims that through such shifts, power became largely invisible, a series of common sense and inevitable ingredients of life in a modern society, and a thing we accept for our own good. Rather than power in its widespread sense, Foucault talks about surveillance. Power is exerted by means of a panoptic organization of society, in which all aspects of our lives are visible and open for inspection by often invisible and unnamed people in power. Decentralized capillary power thus strengthens the power of the center rather than to weaken it. The next lecture will look in more detail to this idea of a panoptic organization of society and how it increases the power of the center.